Hello and welcome to today's video on Kamikaze, an absolutely brilliant poem. Today you will be learning 6 things. First, I'll read the poem through. Skip ahead if you don't want that bit. Then I'm going to teach you to understand the plot because it's actually quite complicated, and the historical context. Then I'm going to move beyond grade 6, so we're going to get to grips with the allusion and symbolism for grades 7, 8 and 9. We're going to explore the soundscape of the poem. I'm not sure that you would have been taught that for grades 8 and 9. That gets you into the real top band. We're going to meet the poet and see what she has to say, which will help you get grades 7, 8 and 9. And then finally, we're going to learn about how to link form and structure in the poem to the poem's meaning, again for grades 7, 8 and 9. Well, I hope you're with me. Her father embarked at sunrise with a flask of water, a samurai sword in the cockpit, a shaven head full of powerful incantations, and enough fuel for a one-way journey into history. But halfway there, she thought, recounting it later on to her children, he must have looked far down at the little fishing boats, strung out like bunting on a green-blue translucent sea. And beneath them, arcing in swathes like a huge flag, waved first one way then the other in a figure of 8, the dark shoals of fishes flashing silver as their bellies swivelled towards the sun, and remembered how he and his brothers, waiting on the shore, built cairns of pearl-grey pebbles, to see whose withstood longest the turbulent inrush of breakers, bringing their father's boat safe. Yes, grandfather's boat, safe to the shore, salt-sodden, awash with cloud-marked mackerel, black crabs, feathery prawns, the loose silver of whitebait, and once a tuna, the dark prince, muscular, dangerous. And, though he came back, my mother never spoke again in his presence, nor did she meet his eyes, and the neighbours too, they treated him as though he no longer existed. Only we children still chattered and laughed, till gradually we too learned to be silent, to live as though he had never returned, that this was no longer the father we loved. And sometimes, she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. Okay, let's get into the plot. So her father is a kamikaze pilot, and he will have left at sunrise because it's early and he needs to go out and crash his plane, which is essentially a bomb, into an American warship. But sun is a symbol here also for Japan. As you'll see, it features as a red sun on its flag. So this is a symbol of his patriotism. He takes water with him because it's purifying, and a samurai sword because this culture glorifies the warrior, and the idea of the samurai warrior is that he fights to his death for his master. He's in the cockpit of an aeroplane, but cockpit is also named after cockfighting, where 2 cocks are put into a ring to fight each other until one of them dies. And so there's also this overtone of this being a sport, something that's not really natural, something unnatural, where the men are being exploited. He's shaven his head in order to purify himself, and he's recited some religious incantations so that he's dying in a pure state for his country. Now let's look at what samurai pilots look like. You'll notice that they're mainly really young, sort of 19 to 24. They only started flying these suicide missions in 1944 when it looked like the Americans were going to beat them. And the Japanese believed that the Americans would come, invade, rape all the women, kill all the young men. And so they were fighting to defend their families. And one of the things that you'll notice in their letters all the time, their letters that they write home, they keep saying, "Remember that I will have died smiling." and so they welcome this. They're not forced into becoming kamikaze pilots. Usually they volunteered, and here's one with his girlfriend who's really happy that he's going off to die such a noble death to defend her country. And though that might seem extraordinary to us, that is the context at the time. This was the kamikaze pilot's job. So this is his plane. It's carrying an 800-pound bomb, and his sole job is to crash that plane into a ship and destroy it. So yes, he will inevitably die, but so will the 2,000 or more sailors on the ship, and the ship will also be lost. We will come across later in the poem the idea of ritual death. So this was something that also happened to the samurai warrior. If they were going to face defeat, they would kill themselves in a ritual way. So here he's reading through his prayers. He has a short samurai dagger, and the idea is that he will slice open his abdomen here and execute himself. So his innards will all spill out. I'm sorry if that's gruesome, but that is part of the culture that we're dealing with. Usually this wasn't done on your own. It was done in front of an audience because it was considered a matter of honour. So hopefully this explains why a Japanese young man would volunteer for a suicide death. And then this final picture of a kamikaze pilot shows him putting on a bandana with the Japanese flag. And so the ultimate honour was to die for your country. Okay, well this is why you only had fuel for a one-way journey. So you either crashed into a ship or it was pointless. You would die not having completed your mission. But this story is now being told by a mother of the speaker. And she's told her children, and it's one of these children who's now telling us about her father, the kamikaze pilot, and her mother, how she behaved when the kamikaze pilot didn't fulfill his mission and actually didn't just fly one way but came home. So much later, probably after the kamikaze pilot, the speaker's father, is dead, her mother is now looking back and trying to work out what must have happened to make him change his mind. This is really sad because she could simply have asked him, but she's refused ever to speak to him again, so she can never know the truth. And it's only after he's gone that she must have thought this way. In other words, it's only now that he's no longer there that she can start thinking of him again as a human being and actually work out what was going on in his head. So she imagines him looking down at the fishing boats, the Japanese fishing boats below him, as he flies out to defend his country. And because he has a bird's eye view, she imagines him looking down and seeing all these shoals of fishes flashing about like a flag. She reaches into his memories and imagines that he, as he flies across, starts to remember how he and his brothers used to wait on the shore. So this is important because the eldest brother would never have become a kamikaze pilot. They would be considered the son and heir. And so, if you like, it's a disposable brother who is sent off to die in this way. And you can imagine that this would be a bit of a conflict in the father's head. You know, why should he die instead of one of the other brothers? Why is he the one who's disposable? So in this memory, she imagines him thinking back to when he and his brothers are waiting for their father's boat to come back. And this is the grandfather's boat of the speaker, of the daughter of the mother or the son of the mother. We don't know which sex they are. So this boat would have been handed down from grandfather to father normally, and the pilot, the father, is flying past these boats thinking about his childhood and thinking about all that worry he had when he was a young boy that his own father wouldn't come back, that the boat would sink. And of course then there's the great irony that he's flying out to sink such a boat, to kill many of those same fathers just like his own. And so this is what she thinks must have caused him to turn back, that memory. But when he did come back, his mother, or her mother, whichever it is, never spoke to her husband again. So he's come back to the same house and the same family, but she refuses to speak to him. And more than that, she didn't even look him in the eyes, because she treats him as though he doesn't exist. And then the neighbours do exactly the same thing. His whole community, everybody he knows, turns against him. So he's isolated, even though he's surrounded by people. And at first, he still has some joy with the children, who still chatter and laugh when they're around him. But then even that is taken away as they learn. So they've obviously taught by the adults to be silent around him. Not just not to talk to him, but also to express no joy or emotion of any kind. So he's totally isolated, even though he's still surrounded by his own family. And then finally, she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. So she obviously thinks, yes, he's died in life because they've isolated him. Was that a better death than dying as a kamikaze pilot? But we also have to consider, why is she telling this now? And it's in the past tense. He must have wondered, and that strongly hints that he has probably killed himself, and she's now telling the story to her children. We don't know that for sure, but the poet strongly hints at that by introducing the idea of the samurai sword right at the beginning of the poem, because it reminds us of that ritualistic death, a death which is normally seen as honourable once you've been defeated. And he's very much been defeated, and so there's this strong implication that he's killed himself. But remember, we don't know that. It's simply an illusion. Okay, now let's delve into the allusions and symbolism of the poem. Instead of the word symbol, however, I'm going to use the word allusion, because it refers to when a writer deals with other ideas that you already know about, or they expect a good reader to already know about. Let me show you what I mean. So instead of writing her father set off, she has written her father embarked. Now, that means got on at sunrise, but you normally embark on a ship. And she does this deliberately in order to remind us of his role as a fisherman. It's the link with fishing and boats which is going to cause him to turn around. So Beatrice Garland deliberately chooses this word to plant in our minds this idea that he's already, when he sets off, uncertain about the morality of killing thousands of men at sea. I've already spoken about the sun being symbolic of the Japanese flag, but we also have an ironic allusion here, because sunrise is like the birth of life, but here it signifies the end of his life. Then we come to this idea of powerful incantations, which are prayers, but the way that this is phrased also suggests that perhaps Beatrice Garland sees these as ridiculous, almost superstitious ideas, which, if you like, brainwash the Japanese pilot into sacrificing his life in this way. It's an unnatural act, which perhaps she disapproves of. We don't know that for certain. But there is a sense that the incantations shouldn't be this powerful. Next, we have the emphasis of the word history, and this idea that the pilots are doing it in order to be remembered for all time. This is a common way that people are persuaded to sacrifice their own lives. Their names will live forever. It's, if you like, a form of brainwashing to get people to sacrifice themselves in this way. Next, we come out to this lovely simile here of the fishing boats strung out like bunting. Bunting is normally triangular shaped, isn't it? Hanging from string. And this triangular shape exactly mimics the shape of the sails of the boats, of the fishing boats that he would have seen from on high. And there's a huge irony, of course, that bunting is a massive celebration, and these pilots are being asked to celebrate their own deaths. You know, I talked about them writing in their letters this idea of them dying with a smile on their face. This is all part of the government and cultural propaganda that this is a noble and happy death. Then even in the description of how these boats are moving, they're described as arcing, just like a sword would arc when you swing it. In other words, in the pilot's head is this idea of the samurai sword and the honourable soldier dying for his master. Then we have a new simile where the boats are like, the fish are like a huge flag being waved underwater. Now, on the one hand, that is a flag of Japan. It conveys the patriotic instinct of the pilot, but also when you wave a flag one way and another on the battlefield, it's a flag of surrender. You don't wave your own flag, and so at that very moment when he's thinking of his country, he's also thinking of surrendering, giving in on this idea of killing himself. And this is then strongly linked to the figure of 8. So the figure of 8 describes the movement of the flag, but it's also a symbolic picture. So we in the West know it for two reasons. So St. Boniface introduced it into Christian symbolism. You'll often see it on old gravestones. And the idea this symbol represents infinity, eternal life, which of course is ironic because it's his eternal life that he will be sacrificing. And so Garland deliberately uses this symbol to suggest that it's a reminder to him that he shouldn't just sacrifice his life, that actually perhaps it's more important to live. This is then contrasted with the movement of the fishes where their bellies swivel towards the sun, again a symbol of patriotism, the sun on the flag, and it makes him question whether he should actually be dying for his country. And I've already mentioned what will be going through his head when he remembers his brothers. You know, they're not sacrificing themselves in this way. Why is he the one to do it? He remembers them building cairns of pebbles on the beachside, but the allusion here is to pearls, something absolutely precious, and to pebbles, which are worthless, if you like. And so torn in the balance here is the preciousness of his life, which is being given away as though it weren't precious. So in this symbolism, the mother of the speaker is remembering her husband and thinking, you know, these are the things that he saw, these are the memories that he had, which must have persuaded him not to kill himself. Then we get to the description of the kinds of things that the grandfather, so the pilot's father, would catch. And so the mackerel are described as marked with patterns that look like clouds. And Garland's made this phrase up because the cloud obviously brings us back to the sky. And the pilot's asking himself, is this a natural way to die? In the same way that you don't expect sea creatures, mackerel, to be touched by the cloud. It's unnatural. And then this idea is also picked on with the prawns, which are described as feathery. And so cloud and feathery both remind us of flight, which obviously reminds us of his flight, the flight that's going to kill him, and it just sounds out of place. It just sounds wrong, in the same way that it seems wrong in the pilot's mind. He shouldn't be sacrificing himself in this way. Then we have this really interesting description of the whitebait, small white fish, referred to as silver. Now, on the one level, this means that they're worth money to the fisherman, to the pilot's father. But on another, they're also linked to the idea of treachery. So in the Christian tradition, Jesus sacrificed his own life to save other people, which is exactly what Kamikaze pilot is doing, but he sacrifices it because he is betrayed by Judas. And Judas is the symbol of that betrayal are the 30 pieces of silver which he is paid by the Romans to let them in to capture Jesus. So that betrayal is always linked in the Christian tradition to the idea of silver. And we've got now this idea that the pilot himself feels he's being betrayed by his own rulers who are asking him to sacrifice his life in this way. And that's then linked to the tuner, which in the mind is now described as a dark prince. So the prince is an allusion to the emperor here, the emperor who's commanding these pilots to kill themselves to defend their country. And this nobility is actually being linked to something sinister, to darkness. So suddenly the mother telling this story thinks that her husband must have realized that this order to kill yourself is actually a corrupt one. It's a betrayal, and it's not a pure way of dying at all. It's just a way of throwing young lives away. And of course, this is what actually happened in Japan, because they had this death cult, if you like, where they were willing to fight to the death in this way. The Americans thought the only way to get the Japanese to surrender was to show them that that wouldn't be enough, that they could annihilate them anyway. And so this led not just to the creation of the atomic bomb, but to actually dropping it, not just on one city, but on two. So hundreds of thousands of people wiped out in an instant, two cities completely flattened in an instant, because the Americans thought, rightly or wrongly, that this was the only way to show to the Japanese that being willing to die was not enough to prevent them being defeated. And the irony is that had the kamikaze pilots not existed, had this death cult not been in place, America might never have dropped the bombs. You know, they might have hoped that the Japanese would simply surrender without risking further hundreds of thousands or millions of people being killed. And then finally, this idea of the honourable death, the better way to die, I've already explained with the images of ritual self-sacrifice, the hara-kiri as we call it these days, which I showed you in this image and this image, which strongly suggests that eventually he's chosen to end his suffering, his isolation, by killing himself. Now the final nuance here is that often the samurai who did kill themselves in this way were ordered to by their own masters if they felt that they'd let them down in some way. And so there's a sense that if the father does kill himself, it's because he feels ordered to by his own family. And Garland allows us to infer this order from these words, as though he no longer existed. In other words, they're already treating him as though he should be dead, and then he simply, perhaps, just obeys that command. Right, let's now turn our minds to the sounds in the poem and try to link those to meaning. I'm going to try and make these convincing. Some you might say, no, Mr. Salles, they're not for me. That's fine. Pick the ones that work for you. You'd only need to mention one, maximum two of these in the exam to score really well, okay? But I'm going to give you loads more because it's not just about the exam. It's also appreciating this awesome poem. So first we've got the assonance of the repeated A's. Father embarked at a flask water, a samurai. They don't all make the harsh A sound, but it also sounds like an ah. It's if you like, a symbol of pain or a lament. And this is contrasted, this pain or lament, with the sibilance of the repetition of S. Sunrise, flask, samurai, sword. Now these are either treated as sinister or as peaceful. Well, if we look at sunrise, we've got the idea of peace, and then samurai sword sounds peaceful but is actually describing something very violent. So right at the very beginning of the poem, we've got this contrast between a peaceful mood and a violent one. And it's designed to unsettle us, but also mimic what's going on in the smiling kamikaze pilot's head. You know, he's going off to death, beautifully at peace, flying soundlessly over this beautiful landscape that he's going to defend, but also he's just about to cause a huge explosion and kill himself. Then we've got this kind of internal rhyme, full of power, full incantations. The F is a fricative, and it's no coincidence that one of our worst swear words begins with an F. If you just pronounce an F, you'll see that it causes your teeth to be bared, you know, they're exposed, and that's an evolutionary tool. It's what we do when we want to be aggressive, and it's no coincidence that when we're swearing aggressively, we choose a word that allows us to bare our teeth. Well, where does this aggression come from? Partly, obviously, it's his aggression going off to war, but it's also at the same time his own aggression at the order that's sending him out to kill himself. It's a conflict in his own mind. Okay, that alone is worth a grade 9, but it's bonus time. So we get these fricatives, the Fs of enough, fuel, for, and half, repeated again in the next quatrain, the next 4 lines here, to do the same job, to emphasize the aggression. Next we have more sibilants, the boats strung, and this is contrasted with the harsher sounds of the repeated T's, strung, bunting, translucent, and then we've got the S sounds, even with that C, the sibilants again. And you can visually see this contrast where he's torn between peace and war, between killing himself and saving himself, between death and life. And that tension is apparent just through the sibilants and the alliterative T's. Again, that's repeated here with the dark shoals of fishes. So you've got the harsh sounds of D and K contrasted again with the sibilants. And that tension is stitched into the poem to reveal the tension within the poet's own mind. Within the father's own mind. Okay, then we've got some repetition of the I sound here. And the only interpretation I could come up with this is it keeps emphasizing the I. And so this is the I of identity. It's me. It's emphasizing his own individuality. So at this point in the poem is when he starts to change his mind. That conflict begins to be resolved. He's no longer going to kill himself. He's going to preserve his identity, his I. I hope you like that one. So after that moment, we lose the sibilants and the emphasis on soft sounds, and we move much more towards harsh sounds, lots of T's and K's, but also the plosive B's. Built, P's are plosives as well. Pearl, pebbles has got both the B's and the P's. Breakers, bringing, boat. These are plosive sounds, so named because your mouth breathes out in an explosive way when you make them. And obviously that links us in the pilot's head to the explosion that he's going to create when he kills himself. And so this reflects his anger at having to sacrifice his life in this way. And it's reflected in the sound, in those plosive B's. And now the poet contrasts this with his memory of his grandfather's boat. So the memory of the grandfather's boat is filled with sibilants, look, because that was a time when he was at peace. And perhaps he's thinking, as he looks at this, even when the Americans defeat us, I'll still be a fisherman. My world will still be the same. I'll still be making my living from the sea. My family will be the same. Do I actually need to sacrifice myself in this way? And then the next thought here, when he looks at the catches of his grandfather, again, they're filled with harsh sounds, the repeated C's and K's, and the plosive B's and D's. So now the mother's storytelling leaves the war behind, and she stopped telling the story, and it's now the daughter, I assume it's a daughter, it could be the son, who's retelling her memory of her family, and she's thinking of how they excluded him, how they refused to speak to him, and she describes those with sharp, harsh sounds: to, treated, existed, still, chattered. And these harsh sounds perhaps reflect that this child is now looking at her father's life and thinking that perhaps they treated him much too harshly. And we see that picked up so that the children also start being described with these harsh sounds: till, to, silent, to. So they then have become harsh towards their father, just like their mother and the neighbours taught them. So now we come to the final couplet of the poem, where the sibilants, "sometimes she said," possibly suggests that the mother is now at peace with her husband, who is probably dead. She's now come to understand his motives, whereas before she couldn't accept them. She couldn't even speak to him. And there's a kind of wistfulness now with the repetition of the W sound, wondered which way, as though she's wondering now, should they have treated him in that way, at the same time as she's thinking he must have wondered whether he should have died at war by sacrificing himself. And again, that conflict is repeated with the plosive B's, and so he's weighing up in his own mind, was he right to choose the peace of living against the violence of death? Okay, it is impossible to get the very top grade without discussing the poet's purpose. I've given you a range of purposes here. You only need one, and you need to pick one that actually suits your interpretation of the poem. So it could be to understand a cultural moment in Japanese and American history, this precise 1944 to 1945 history. Or it could be to explore wider themes, because she is an English poet. She's not Japanese. I don't even know if she's travelled to Japan, but it's got wider purpose and asking, what is patriotism really? Is a country actually worth dying for? What the hell is a country? Does it matter that much? Would we kill ourselves rather than be part of Europe? I don't know. It's also to understand the importance of forgiveness. That's why the speaker is speaking the poem to us, and she's looking at her own mother's thoughts. Has the mother now finally forgiven her husband for not killing himself? Its imagery asks us to consider, what is a life worth living? Do you live for your family? And if your family reject you, is that a kind of death? What makes a well-worth life? Is it silver, just earning loads of money? Or is it living in a particular community? What is it? Does it examine the importance of motherhood? It's the mother who brings up the children to reject the father in this community. Are men just brought up to deal with the harsher side of life, like war? And is it only mothers who are allowed to create a civilized society? Or is it any other purpose that you want? Your skill is in reading the poem and coming up with a purpose that suits you. Don't choose the obvious one that everyone else will choose, which is it's an anti-war poem, for example. Now, you can visit Beatrice Garland's excellent website, and on that she talks about visiting schools, and her interest is in exploring other people's worlds. In other words, her purpose is in trying to understand how other people think and what their cultures are. Poetry is a way of talking about how each of us sees, and of the different worlds and the people in them. So it's that exploring not just of what a place looks like, but actually how people understand their place in that world. And that's what fascinates her. And you can easily link that to not just the thoughts of the father, but also the mother as she changes her view about him. And then finally the child who is now speaking, narrating the poem to us. What are her thoughts? Garland also gives us a really good clue as to which poem to compare this to. because her favourite poet included in the anthology, which she's very excited to be in, by the way, is Seamus Heaney, Storm on the Island. So I'm going to make a Storm of the Island video next and try and link it to this one, because you've got an easy link there straight from the poet herself. And then down here she tells us why she is interested in students reading her poems. So she's interested in their challenges and complaints and questions. She wants us to be passionate, and she doesn't want the poem to be totally obvious. You know, it doesn't have to be obscure, but this is quite a powerful thing, I think, for students to learn, is that you bring your own experience and ideas to a poem that you read. There's never a fully definitive answer where every teacher in the country can say, hey students, it's this. Well, it isn't. It's nuances and variations of this. And if you hate that, English literature isn't for you, but I can still get you through the exam. And if you love it, then English literature is for you, and you should do it at A level. And then she has this great bit of advice for those of you thinking about writing your own poem, is forget rhyming for the moment and just write with energy. And hopefully the soundscape part of this video would really help you to do that. Think about the sounds your words make. And that's also why I read it out to you at the beginning, so you get a sense of how I hear the poem, and that might even clash with how you hear it and give you a stronger sense of what you want. And then finally about Beatrice Garland, she actually likes receiving emails from students and she replies to them, but as you can see here, gets really annoyed when people don't write back. So I am, after I've written this video, I am going to write to her and thank her for this brilliant poem. And I will reply, Beatrice, I promise, if you write back to me. Okay, let's finish off. Well done if you're still here, and even better, well done if you've managed to fast forward to the bit that you needed. Maybe you just wanted to understand the poem's form and link that to meaning. So this is how it appears on Beatrice Garland's website, and she's split each stanza into 6 lines. First we have the 6 lines telling us about the father and his journey as he's flying his plane, and then we have the inclusion of italics where we start to see the mother's personality. So this inclusion here, with the dashes interrupting in parenthesis, yes, grandfather's boat, tells us that she's actually retelling a story to her children now. Now you don't retell a story usually if the father is still alive, so it's another clue that the father is now dead or has disappeared, and she's trying to explain the father's life. Now what's interesting here as well, this sounds like she's just telling her children, she's telling them about their grandfather's boat. Normally that boat would have been handed down to the father, you know, who would also be sailing it with him. And there's this implication that the father has been excluded from that as well. He probably isn't even allowed to fish anymore. Then in the italics here, we stop getting the mother's view and we start getting the child speaker's view. Now, obviously, this child is now herself an adult, and this italics gives us a clue that the speaker is now examining the mother's role. Does she agree with what the mother did? And then her own role in listening to her mother's teaching and stopping from chattering and laughing, and if you like, excluding her father completely. And here we've got a really poignant sort of ending of her own thoughts, where she said, this was no longer the father we loved. So on one level, she's saying they've been trained out of loving him. It's not culturally permitted to still love him. But on the other hand, she's saying, I did love my father up until that change when I was taught not to. And she's remembering that he was actually someone worthy of love. And in this tension at the end of the poem, perhaps she's wondering whether she shouldn't have treated him in this way, whether she should have forgiven him and continued to show that love. And then finally we got the final couplet, which comes back to the mother's thoughts. And ultimately that might suggest that it is the mother's view that dominates the daughter. In a wider society, it's our mothers who have more influence on us than our fathers. Sadly, that's absolutely true. I say that sadly because I'm a father. And that's why you have this couplet here not in italics, to suggest that it's the mother's view that he was probably better off dead, that wins. And the reader might be expected to reject the mother's view. You know, we can't entirely enter into the mindset that would think he was better off dead than being alive and a father to his family. So that's my interpretation. As you can see, I've got totally overexcited by this poem, and the video is 41 minutes long. But hey, if you've got here, you're definitely on for a 7 or an 8 or a 9. Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.